It is Wednesday, April the 25th, 2018. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, we have a lot of charts for us to go through, so therefore we will pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing, or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing in the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's macro online updates. The research document this month updates regional developments. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of our monthly report: global risk, macro, and U.S. economic developments. As I often do, I'd like to tie them together into part two of a single discussion concerning what I see as the unintended consequences of flawed monetary policy and how we are forcing more and more global corporations to become zombie corporations. I would like to therefore cover the items outlined here as part two. So what is a zombie corporation specifically? The best definition is, in my mind, from the Bank of International Settlements. And to quote them, it is a listed firm with 10 years or more of existence, where the ratio of EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, relative to interest expense is lower than 1. More simply said, a zombie company is one that merely survives due to the constant refinancing of its debt, and despite restructuring and low rates is still unable to cover its interest expense with operating profits, let alone repay the principal. I found it interesting that the BIS is now so focused on this subject that it has begun tracking and categorizing it. The chart shown here is from BIS research, where they now astoundingly assert that over 10% of all global corporations presently fall in that category. The global growth in zombie corporations has one common central ingredient: easy credit for too long a period of time. Instead of companies failing, they simply mutate to a new form of financial life support. One of the core foundations of capitalism is rewarding ingenuity and productivity, while the weak or obsolete enterprises are left to fail. This is a fundamental requirement for capitalism to flourish. The word bankruptcy today is seldom heard anymore. We should ask why. Not only why there aren't more failures, but also why failing companies are kept on financial life support. What are the incentives, the financial rewards for doing this? We're going to answer these questions in a moment, where we'll see there are differing reasons by economic region, but the underlying catalyst is all the same: easy credit for too long a period of time. You can see from this chart that the corporations have been the biggest beneficiaries of this credit, yet it gets little public scrutiny or visibility, likely because stocks are going up. Few pay attention to problems until stocks start going down. Then everyone begins asking, why? Again, as you see here, it is a global corporate issue, which has manifested itself into the global problem of challenged firms. Note that this study shows 20% of all global corporations are now considered challenged versus the BIS's 10%. We can expect, as this chart also suggests, that both numbers will likely and significantly rise during the next recession. A recession that, after a historically long 9-year cycle, has a high probability of soon occurring. The high-yield junk market, which is one of our strategic investment insights on the site, is likely to be the first evidence of this, but also we have determined will probably include CCC, that is the low end of the investment-grade bond market. As I mentioned, though we have the same global catalysts, we have different regional symptoms, all soon coming together to take the economy with it, as we potentially have a global zombie economy emerging. Before we step through the regional differences, let's consider some cross-regional commonalities. China has the largest relative growth, but altogether the regional areas are now comparable as a percentage of non-financial corporate debt, and still growing. The growth in leverage that corporations are now employing does not bode well for future stability if interest rates were to rise or cash flows to fall, as regional economies slowed, or possibly the overall global economy slowed itself, something we're currently seeing signs of, which I outlined in last month's macro outlook. This graphic illustrates investment-grade corporate debt. It is obviously worse for non-investment grade debt or high-yield debt. This is the speculative domain of desperate yield-chasing investment speculators. Going into 2016, the concern with cash flows or EBITDA to debt levels was already a growing concern as the problem became more acute. Recently, released numbers are showing the problem to be more readily apparent. We are on the edge of a cliff, or possibly already over it. Corporate earnings, which drive the available cash flow, are forecast to become a problem in 2019. The latest global debt numbers suggest corporate debt is still growing at a significant 5.9% compound rate, second only to sovereign governments. Meanwhile, banks are pulling in the reins on a relative basis. What do they see? We talked about that also recently. Total global debt is currently north of $233 trillion, which suggests to us that the users of corporate products and services may already be, or soon will be, tapped out. Let's now step through the regions. In our last Under the Lens, we examined China. I will refer listeners who haven't already heard Part 1 to listen to the detailed info on China. For those that haven't done so, the message is simple. The dominance of SOEs, that is, state-owned enterprises, in China is not fully appreciated by the world. This quasi-capitalist communist country that is China has a differing approach towards corporations. Most of the 150,000 Chinese SOEs are living off cheap, available funding with protected and subsidized markets, many with monopolies. Employment is more important to the Chinese Communist Party than profits. Profits are secondary to employment. This is exactly the opposite to the rest of the world and has profound implications for fair and open trade. Chinese private debt is now officially 93% of GDP, and many, such as Moody's, suspect much higher when shadow banking lending is properly accounted for. The Bank of International Settlements now has China's corporate debt estimated to be higher, much higher, at close to 170% of GDP, and racing higher at an almost unstoppable level. If you listen to the detail in Part 1, you'll see it is a runaway freight train that will, in all likelihood, sometime in the next 24 months, spectacularly derail. In many ways, Japan is the casualty of similar explosive trade growth as China, earlier in the 1980s and 90s. Since then, Japan has suffered through 2 decades of zombification of both the economy and many of its formerly strong Japanese corporations. The collapse of asset values and the efforts by the Japanese government to keep Japanese banks solvent led to the earliest forms of financial repression policies of qualitative and quantitative easing. These, in turn, as a result of unintended consequences and moral hazard, led to the growth in zombie corporations. The term zombie company was actually first applied to Japanese firms supported by Japanese banks during the period known as the Lost Decade. That is, after the collapse of the Japanese asset price bubble in the 1990s. Japanese banks to this day continue to support weak or failing firms. The retailer Daiwa is an example of a large company that expanded greatly during the period leading to the 1990 crash and under different circumstances would have been expected to have entered receivership or bankruptcy. The finance minister at the time was reported as describing the 96,000 employee firm as being, quote, too big to fail, unquote. We've certainly heard that expression many times a decade later in the U.S. with the same prescription as the solution, which is also yet to be proven successful. Corporate Japan achieved a rare feat in the fiscal year 2016. Not one of its almost 4,000 publicly traded firms filed for bankruptcy protection. What an economy, as the yen at that time was steadily falling. Economists have been shouting about this problem for years now. Way back in 2003, a paper called Unnatural Selection, Perverse Incentives, and the Misallocation of Credit in Japan found, and I quote, Japanese firms are far more likely to receive additional credit if they are in poor financial condition, and these firms continue to perform poorly after receiving additional bank financing. Troubled Japanese banks allocate credit to severely impaired borrowers primarily to avoid the realization of losses on their own balance sheets. End of quote. In 2008, before the global financial crisis had hit Japan, another paper entitled Zombie Lending and Depressed Restructuring in Japan declared, and I quote again, large Japanese banks often engage in sham loan restructuring that keeps credit flowing to otherwise insolvent borrowers, which we call zombies. The congestion created by the zombies reduces the profits for healthy firms, which discourages their entry and investment. Zombie-dominated industries exhibit more depressed job creation and destruction and lower productivity. End of quote. Yet another 2009 paper found that the Japanese government's bailouts of major banks made these problems even worse. These papers all came before the creation of the INCJ and other similar government bailout funds. The government hopes that the INCJ and its ilk will impose more stringent conditions on the companies it rescues, but the bailout funds obviously offer an incentive for bad behavior. Japan still can't let its bad companies die. Japanese finance is dominated by large government-backed banks that want to preserve the supremacy of their large zombie clients. So while the U.S. bailouts might have hurt productivity somewhat, the situation in Japan is just much, much worse. If Japan wants to generate long-term growth, it needs to allow creative destruction, like everywhere else. New companies can't grow when they are blocked by failing incumbents. The aspiring entrepreneur watching cartoons on his TV at Waseda University must be allowed to do his thing. Japan's cycle of bailouts must end, but it won't. Prior to me starting this recording, I listened to the BOJ governor in Japan being interviewed, and he emphatically stated that further accommodative monetary policy will be maintained for some time to come, minimally through 2019. When you don't know what to do and are expected to do something, the proven political solution is consistently to print more money. European Union zombie corporations are also an indirect result of the EU banking crisis in 2012, most visibly with Greece and Cyprus, but also including Spain, Portugal, and Italy, the EU southern peripheral nations. Those countries with the poorest productivity rates, highest unemployment levels, and heaviest government-entitled obligations and dependencies. Frankly, this crisis, which was temporarily papered over, is a long ways from being solved and is still percolating just below the surface. The problems with zombie corporations will soon bring it to a boil once again. The EU, and specifically the ECB, adopted a unique approach to kicking the can down the road by implementing what they called the CSPP, or Corporate Sector Purchase Program. The central bank began buying corporate EU bonds. It is still doing such today at a rate of $30 billion per month, only recently down from $60 billion a month. This not only allowed the EU country national banks to unload their bad corporate debt holdings onto the central banks, but has effectively become a life support system for failing EU corporations. Interest rates for corporate bonds are presently held at ridiculously low prices, allowing them to refinance at close to zero and have the central banks absorb the supply. Meanwhile, as yields have fallen because of central bank demand, the originating banks have had bond price appreciation across the board. You will recall that as yields go down, bond prices or value goes up. A wonderful scheme, until, of course, the hens come home to roost. Now, many German and French corporations have become dominant participants using debt to keep corporate earnings per share up as revenue growth stagnates. The percentage of stock 600 zombie corporations now reflects this. Of course, the biggest gamers of corporate buybacks is the domain of the U.S.-based corporations. Financial engineering is the name of the game in the United States. We've talked about this extensively in many Under the Lens videos, so there's no need to dwell on the mechanics going on here. We encourage you to review the latest long-wave video on the gaming of the float pool by private equity corporations, whose strategies are most recognizing as turning viable corporations into zombies as they load them up with debt, strip out the cash flow in the form of dividends. Then these corporations are unable to invest for the future for the sake of quarterly earnings per share results to drive near-term stock prices. Then they are unloaded to the trash heap or kept alive as zombies. Corporations are not forecasting any slowdown in their 2018 stock buyback intentions. The game goes on. U.S. corporate debt levels are now at levels that preceded previous financial and market crises. Total U.S. private debt is at historical levels and hides the fact it was the consumer who were forced to temporarily deleverage, not corporations, during the 2008 housing-centric financial crisis. This is shown here as we have a disconnect between U.S. corporate debt and productive capital. The bottom line of all this is that zombie corporations in the U.S. are approaching 15% of the S&P 500 listed companies. It begs the question, how long can this go on? The answer may be 2019. Also remembering, once again, the market leads by 8 to 10 months. All our work in cycle theory suggests to us that we are nearing a multi-generational cycle event. We can expect the reality of global zombie corporations to be a prime problem during this period. So in closing, as I always do, remember, the answer to solving these problems will be to print more money. It is the only answer politicians will ever agree on. Invest accordingly. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2018 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I thank you very much for listening.